The first half of Metro Last Light's campaign gave me one of the best gaming experiences I've ever had. I spent around 5 hours hooked to my screen, stalking dark corners, ghosting past enemies and exploring the corners of run-down buildings to ensure I had enough air filters to make it back to the relative safety of the Metro tunnel system. It's been a while since I set self-imposed challenges such as getting through entire levels without killing anyone and even forcing restarts if I failed. I used to do this when playing the first couple of Metal Gear Solid games, but that was 20 years ago. I had a little more time on my hands back then. As you've probably guessed, the second half of the campaign didn't go so smoothly. I suffered from a known and yet unpatched bug that made it nigh on impossible to continue my no-kill run while also going for the good ending. A few hours later another bug reared its head, also well known and unpatched, which meant I lost my entire playthrough about 7 hours in. I'm not typically forgiving of bugs, especially when they are game breaking and should have been rectified by the developers years ago. When you're hit by a major bug and a quick Google search shows people complaining about it 4 years ago, it's hard to not get frustrated and take it out on the developers. However, a little bit of context can be important. First of all, these bugs popped up on my second playthrough. They weren't in my first or third playthroughs. Second, while I always judge a product separate from the developer where possible, the amount of criticism that a developer deserves for mistakes does depend on circumstances. The bugs are a problem, likewise the fact they were never fixed. When it comes to apportioning blame, it's only fair to look at the resources of the developer. There's a difference between a huge developer like BioWare releasing Mass Effect Andromeda when it's not finished, and the moderately sized 4A games putting out Metro Last Light among terrible working conditions. Regardless of the bugs, both major and minor, Last Light is a damn good game. It's a comfortable 4 out of 5 and is phenomenal value when purchased as part of the Redux bundle of 2033 and Last Light, which is often on sale for around $6. There's a written review of the Redux bundle available on my website, which is linked in the description. I've already done a video on Metro 2033 and you should probably watch that one before this. Many of 2033's mechanics are similar to those of Last Light, especially when focusing on the Redux versions, and I won't be repeating all of that again in any great detail. In the 2033 video I spent a lot of time going over the gameplay mechanics and how good a job 4A games did with nailing immersion. Most of that applies again to Last Light and I don't want to just repeat myself. That means this video might sound more negative than 2033's video because I'm focusing on some of the unique problems of Last Light. To be clear, I think Last Light is a better game than 2033, quite a bit better actually. I recommend you give the Metro games a go because Metro Exodus is looking damn impressive, and if it can fix a few of the issues I have with Last Light, there's a very real chance it will be my 2019 game of the year. There will be spoilers from here on out, so if you do want to play Last Light, maybe stop watching. The Metro games are more about the experience and the story, but Last Light is certainly more story intensive than 2033. Each to their own when it comes to spoilers of course, but you've been warned. Before delving into Last Light, I'd like to take a few minutes to look at its troubled development. I have a fair few criticisms, but I want to put them into context because 4A Games pulled off a minor miracle in making Last Light as good as it is. At the time it developed Metro 2033 and Last Light, 4A Games was based in Kiev, Ukraine. It was a team of around 80 people, so not small as such, but far from the headcount available to major developers. More importantly, the employees of 4A Games worked in terrible conditions. After the release of Last Light, Jason Rubin, the former president of THQ, the company that published 2033, wrote an article on Games Industry Biz where he described the staff as sitting on folding wedding chairs literally elbow to elbow at card tables in what looked more like a packed grade school cafeteria than a development studio. When the team wanted to buy some new office chairs, they had to get them from Poland. However, getting the chairs back into the Ukraine required an expedition payment, which is fancy talk for a bribe. The bribe trebled the cost of the chairs, but this was still the cheapest way of getting them. In the end, it wasn't the expedition payment that put an end to the chair purchase, it was the fact that if they bought the chairs they wouldn't have been able to fit them all into the office. It would have required space they didn't have. When 4A Games needed more computer hardware, employees had to fly to the US and sneak it back into the Ukraine in their backpacks to avoid customs. Power and heating were both supplied by the government and would regularly break down, leaving staff to power up generators at weekends and work in parkas to bear the cold. You wouldn't even know for sure if you had a home to go back to at the end of the day. Rubin tells the story of an employee going home at the end of a long day only to be met by a group of thugs who told him he had 24 hours to find new accommodation. Some of Rubin's comments seem unbelievable, however Andrew Prokhorov, the creative director at 4A Games, didn't contradict any of it, and Rubin was one of the few THQ employees to visit the team in Kiev and therefore has first-hand knowledge. He may have exaggerated slightly. Behind the scenes footage shows an office that certainly looks a little cramped, but it's not quite wedding chairs at card tables. It does look more like an old internet cafe than a studio though. Rubin's comments about the regular power cuts certainly stand up to scrutiny. Rubin wrote the article because he felt 4A Games hadn't received the credit it deserved for creating a great game under these conditions. He referred to Last Light's Metacritic rating of 80 and said that even though this is a good score, it doesn't tell the whole story. And he's right. I actually think a score of 80 is on point, especially considering the lack of a Ranger mode with release, which I'll discuss later. But the fact is there are plenty of mediocre games out there which somehow receive higher Metacritic scores, and therefore a score of 80 doesn't stand out when perhaps it should. In response to Rubin's article, Prokhorov emphatically said that 4A games deserve the ratings it got and that the final consumer doesn't care about our conditions, we need no indulgence. And he's right here too. Working conditions can help contextualise a game's development, but they don't make much difference to the end consumer. Yes, Rockstar has vastly more resources than 4A games, but both developers put out products that cost $60 on release. In addition to rough working conditions, there are plenty of problems behind the scenes that hinder development. Metro 2033 was developed by 4A Games but published by THQ, and THQ owned the IP. In May 2011, THQ stated that the sequel to Metro 2033 would be called Metro Last Light, putting to bed rumours that the sequel would have been called Metro 2034. There is a book called Metro 2034, but it's a big departure from 2033, focusing on Hunter instead of Artyom, so moving away from the naming structure of the books was a good call. THQ stated that Last Light would release in 2012. The release got pushed back until 2013 and then disaster struck. THQ declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy and had to auction off its IP, including the Metro series. Koch Media purchased the IP for just shy of $6 million and assigned it to one of its gaming subsidiaries, Deep Silver, to publish the nearly complete Last Light. Developing a game under this kind of uncertainty would have been tough enough by itself, however the change in ownership caused more problems than just added stress and confusion. Deep Silver only took over publishing responsibilities 2 months before release, and that didn't leave a lot of time for promotion. Metro Last Light wasn't even listed on the publisher's website at the time of release. Marketing is crucial for all games, but arguably Last Light needed it more than most. 2033 was well received by critics, but didn't exactly set the world on nuclear fire. Last Light would be coming to PS3, whereas 2033 had only been on Xbox and PC, so millions of gamers needed reassuring that they could play the sequel without having played the first game. The biggest marketing problem was caused by THQ, who sold the Metro franchise with a large turd attached that couldn't easily be cleaned off: pre-order bonuses. As you may remember from my 2033 video, there were a lot of difficulty settings and modes, however my favourite by far was the Ranger mode, which made resources scarce and Artyom weaker, but also made human enemies weaker. Ranger mode was tense and yet fair, the perfect balance. I'm not alone in this opinion. Many other fans and critics love the Ranger mode, and it's often recommended as the best way to play the game, albeit not usually for a first playthrough. You'd have thought THQ would push the Ranger mode heavily when preparing for the sequel. The way enemies took less damage to kill made it much more than just a generic harder difficulty setting. If anything, you'd expect the sequel to be based around this mode. But no, THQ insisted that the Ranger mode be pulled out and made available as a pre-order bonus or for a separate $5 purchase. You can imagine how well this went down with fans, YouTubers and the like. If you haven't played the Metro games, this might not seem like a huge deal, but if you'd played Metro 2033 and were eagerly awaiting Last Light, this would have annoyed you no end. I might not have purchased Last Light out of principle. While Deep Silver ended up publishing Last Light instead of THQ, it was apparently too late to do anything about the Ranger mode being sold separately. Pre-orders had already been sold and changing the bonus was likely deemed more hassle than it was worth. I'm sure something could have been done, but I'm not going to place the blame at Deep Silver's door. Not when there's a far more obvious culprit in THQ. Either way, Metro Last Light wasn't getting a lot of press, and when it did, that press was negative. It needed a marketing budget and it didn't get it. Fortunately, the future looks a little brighter, literally, for 4A Games. Following the political turmoil in the Ukraine in 2014, 4A Games moved its base of operations to Malta. The new office looks like a substantial improvement, although they could still use some decent chairs. 4A Games developed 2033 and Last Light in terrible conditions, and THQ screwed it over with pre-order nonsense and then by going into bankruptcy at the worst possible time. Conditions will be very different from Metro Exodus, so 4A Games has the opportunity to produce its best possible work. The bad news is that this time it won't have any excuses. It won't want them. In my 2033 video I didn't spend all that much time discussing the story, but I'd like to give a quick plot synopsis this time around because the changes in storytelling style are subtle and yet significant. It's a perfect illustration of developers improving one aspect of their craft. In Metro 2033 there was barely a story to discuss. The world was interesting, however remarkably little happened. 2033 can be summed up as: Hunter asked Artyom to warn Polis about the threat of the Dark Ones. Despite being captured, Artyom managed to get to Polis and pass the message to Miller. Artyom, Miller and a couple of members of the Order went out to D6 to launch missiles at the Dark Ones, wiping them out in the process. Reducing stories down to a couple of sentences is often unfair, but in this case it's really not. That's basically it. The story lacked momentum. The pacing was decent, with a regular mix of indoor and outdoor sections plus set pieces and chill out areas to calm down. However, as a story there isn't much to remember it by except for the ending. I mainly put this down to the problem that Artyom was constantly reacting to what was happening to him instead of taking deliberate action to accomplish his goals. This led to a story that was grounded but uneventful. A low-key story like this can add an increased sense of realism. For example, having to sneak past a group of warring Nazis and Red Line soldiers without getting involved in the conflict was perfectly fitting. Artyom wasn't a hero that could gun them all down, he was vulnerable and had to stick to the shadows. However, this scene didn't advance any of the story. Artyom needed to get to Polis, and to do that he had to get past the soldiers. He got past the soldiers and still needed to get to Polis. Stories are typically more gripping if the protagonist is proactive instead of reactive. This can be achieved with minor and almost meaningless changes, and yet it all adds up over the course of the story. Take that mission from Metro 2033 where you sneak past the Nazis. How about instead of just needing to sneak past them, you'll set the task of infiltrating their camp to steal a passcode or a key, or rescue a hostage who knows a secret route. That's nothing special, but it means Artyom has a goal he has to achieve before carrying on with his main quest. If this happened throughout 2033, the story would have been more engaging. Fortunately, Last Light is a big improvement, as can be seen by comparing two similar set pieces from Metro 2033 and Metro Last Light. In 2033 you had to get through a bunch of Nazis on a railcar. They were just an obstacle to get past on the way to Polis. In Last Light there's a similar section where you're in a railcar, albeit this time you are firing regular weapons so it isn't strictly a turret section. Artyom's motivation is that he needs to reach the train on which the Dark One is being held captive. It's a rescue mission. Sure, you're on literal rails again, but you have an immediate purpose, and when many similar sections are added up over the course of the game, it makes a huge difference to how engaging the story is. It's certainly possible to make an engaging story where the protagonist is just reacting to events without a goal in mind. However, it's far easier to make an engaging story when your protagonist is proactive and making decisions. I was also impressed with how Last Light fleshed out parts of the world that were underdeveloped in 2033. We learned far more about the Dark Ones, Artyom's backstory, the factions, and even the war that led to all this destruction. I didn't bother creating a wishlist for Last Light's story in my 2033 video because the game had already been out for years. If I had, then all those things would have been on it. Last Light begins shortly after the bad ending to Metro 2033. In case you can't remember, the bad ending was Artyom launching the missile strike against the Dark Ones and wiping them all out. Or so everyone thought. The Rangers still hold D6, although that isn't likely to last forever. D6 is a previously unexplored location, so everyone in the Metro is somewhat excited about the prospect of looting all those previously unexplored rooms. There's going to be a big meeting between the heads of all the major factions to decide the fate of D6 and its supplies. However, in the meantime, Miller wants you to go and investigate rumours of a surviving Dark One spotted on the surface. Khan pleads with Miller to capture the Dark One as opposed to kill it, but Miller isn't having any of that. He sends his daughter, Anna, a sniper expert, out with Artyom to make sure the Dark One is killed. The resources at D6 are a huge deal. People are getting by in the Metro, so there's likely no immediate need for additional food. However, the supplies represent something bigger. Back when the war first started, the people in the Metro stations believed that the Russian president had made it to safety and that there would soon be a world to get back to. The people in the Metro worked together to survive until they could make it back to the surface. The Metro is only supposed to be a temporary home. Then everyone found out that the Russian president had died, and so had everyone else. As far as they know, they're all that's left of humanity. For all intents and purposes, the Metro stations are the world now. That's all there is. That depressing thought gave rise to a struggle for the remaining resources, which in turn led to various factions who sought to take control of the Metro with slightly different ideologies. So long as the factions all have their territory, things can remain relatively stable. But now that there is something new to fight over, a big battle starts to look inevitable. Khan's little speech during this introductory section is an attempt to catch up new players or those who didn't get the bad ending for Metro 2033. As such, it's a little clumsy, but it gets both the player and Artyom up to speed. Those who read the book of Metro 2033 will still be a little ahead of Artyom, but that gets fixed later. Artyom and Anna quickly find the Dark One, a child that managed to survive the destruction of its species by being outside the blast zone. It always seemed a little unlikely that every single Dark One would be in that particular spot. The Nazis then show up, capturing Artyom and the Dark One. Artyom escapes with the help of a Red Line communist called Pavel. The next couple of chapters are one long attempt to escape the Nazis and get back to the safety of the Red Line, where Pavel promises to help Artyom on his way. The factions were never all that fleshed out in 2033 because they just served as temporary interruptions on your journey. They were so paper thin that at one point Artyom remarked how the Reds and Nazis were essentially the same, and we had no reason to disagree with him. In Last Light, the factions get far more screen time. Artyom spends a lot of time with Pavel, which helps him realise that perhaps there's a little more to some of the factions than clear good and evil. Not with the Nazis though. Artyom knows they're evil. That much is obvious. The Nazis execute a prisoner because his head is the wrong size, and they're about to hang Pavel when you rescue him. The Nazis aren't subtle, but there's more to the Reds. Both sides have done bad things, but it appears the Reds have an ideology beyond just the hatred of other people. They might be doing bad things, but maybe they're doing those things in the name of something bigger and more important. Well, no, they're not. No sooner do you make it to the Red Line than Pavel betrays you. He wasn't just any old member of the Red Line, he was a major. Under the influence of a truth serum, Artyom tells the Reds about the Dark Ones and how there's still one left alive that the Nazis have sold to the Hansa. After a sympathetic Red helps Artyom escape, he crawls through the vents, listening in on conversations so that we can piece together what's going on. The Reds are officially led by Chairman Moscovin, however all the control lies with the head of intelligence, General Corbett. Corbett was the one who encouraged Moscovin to kill his own brother to become chairman, and in all but name he's the one leading this revolution. Corbett is also working with Lesnitsky, a spy who infiltrated the Rangers. While in D6, Lesnitsky stole a virus and Corbett is planning to release it in the Venice station. Before that, they plan to do a test run on a neutral station because it connects other Hansa stations and should cause a suitable disruption. Artyom follows Pavel's trail until he briefly reunites with Anna. Lesnitsky attacks the base and takes Anna hostage. I'm assuming Anna is taken as hostage to influence Miller in the D6 negotiations should it come to that. This part of the story feels a little flimsy, but once again it gives Artyom a new motivation to keep moving forward. This is when Last Light reaches new levels of grim. The series has always been dark and depressing. That's the nature of living underground after the end of the world. Last Light has haunting moments throughout, such as witnessing the start of the war from the cockpit of a passenger chair or the living room of Moscow residents. These moments are haunting and I hope the war gets fleshed out in future games. The next few chapters make everything seem so far look like a Mario beach level by comparison. It's a credit to the world created by 4A Games that it only takes enemies wearing gas masks indoors to set you on edge. Gas masks are a common feature of the Metro games, however until now you've only needed them on the surface. Now you have to use them below ground because the Reds have released poison in Otibreskia station. The Red Line then entered the station on the pretense of doing cleanup. Cleanup in this case includes executing people who aren't even sick. The Red Line doesn't look all that different from the Nazis now, does it? Artyom was right the first time. You rescue Anna and get the opportunity to shoot Lesnitsky. This is one of the key moments that affects your ending. If you want the good ending, then do what he says and take off your mask. Artyom and Anna escape and get placed in a quarantine centre set up by Hansa. They get the all clear, but not before a quick "we might not have long left to live" fade to black sex scene. Despite the grim setting, I couldn't help but laugh here. It's so obvious they're about to have sex because Anna's strap is hanging off her shoulder. When it comes to depictions of sex and women, that's about as subtle as it gets for 4A games. More on that later. The next section plays out like a walking simulator, but it manages to be one of the most deeply depressing moments in a video game. You walk past quarantines listening to people exchanging their last words as the inevitable happens. Dead bodies are burned and guards prevent people from leaving. It's brutal. Hansa initially look like the good guys here. They've spent a lot of money on the quarantine area and that's not a step they take lightly. However, they're likely only being this generous because the disease could affect them. They still charge full price to those who need medicine and other essentials after being kicked out of their homes. And let's not forget that Hansa bought the Dark One from the Nazis solely to have it around as an amusement. None of the factions have a perfect record. Hell, even the Rangers are a bit dubious depending on how you look at it. When it comes to arrangements for D6, there's a definite we know best arrogance about the Rangers, and their attitude towards the Dark Ones isn't exactly friendly. Speaking of which, Khan and Artyom go out on a mystical adventure to uncover the truth of the Dark Ones. Thanks to a magical river, Artyom remembers that a Dark One saved him as a child. Artyom was the first human the Dark Ones ever met, which is given as the reason for the special connection they share. This connection also helps them find the location of the remaining Dark One. He's on a Hansa train that has been captured by the Reds. After rescuing the Dark One, you spend a few chapters with him helping you out while you hunt down Pavel and Lesnitsky. He marks enemies for you and will occasionally bring you ammo, air filters and health packs. He's also quite cute when he wears human clothing and even disguises himself as a human at times so that people aren't freaked out. This of course does beg the question. If the Dark Ones could look like humans, why didn't they try to reach out to humans in that disguise? It would have been easier than trying to approach them in mutated form. You can kill or spare the lives of Lesnitsky and Pavel, which are also important moments when it comes to determining your ending. Last Light comes to a hectic conclusion. The big meeting to decide the fate of D6 goes ahead. The Dark One reads Moscovin's mind and sees how he killed his brother and plotted to take control of the Metro. Moscovin conveniently says this all out loud for everyone to hear and then confesses. It's too late because Corbett is already preparing to launch an offensive on D6 on behalf of the Reds. The Dark One discovers that there are other Dark Ones alive in a previously unexplored vault in D6, so he sets off to find them. This is where the good ending and the bad ending split. If you're going to get the good ending, then the Dark One tells you that he will return with help. If it's the bad ending, then he tells you that he can't help. You fight the Reds as they launch attack after attack, but you're finally overwhelmed. All pretense of stealth is abandoned here, but it's a decent set piece nonetheless and feels far less artificial and contrived than similar scenes in other games. There are a few standard waves of enemies, then a flamethrower guy in heavy armour arrives and you have to shoot through the line of shields to reach him, before finally dealing with a train. The bit against the train was a touch annoying. There were clearly explosives behind one of the guards, however shooting it does absolutely nothing. I then noticed that the wheels were also red, so I shot them. Once again it did nothing. You're actually supposed to shoot the bar that connects the two wheels first, and then the wheels themselves, and then you can finally hit the explosives behind the enemies, which have been there the entire time. This is the first time in any of the games you've ever had to blow up a vehicle, and not enough is done to let the player know what is required. 4A Games makes this mistake a few times, with the visual language not always being up to scratch in a game that otherwise looks phenomenal. There were similar moments in the first game where you could suddenly break parts of the environment that were usually indestructible. I appreciate the attempt to keep things varied, however getting stuck on this train section can really ruin the flow of an otherwise great set piece. I checked around a bit online and saw a few people who had that exact experience. It wasn't too bad for me because I completed Last Light multiple times and got to experience the set piece in the way it was intended. However, many people completed the game on a sour note, which is a shame. In the bad ending, which this time is not canon, Artyom activates a bomb, blowing everyone up to stop the Reds getting access to more of the virus. We see Anna with a child, which was presumably conceived while in quarantine. In the good ending, the Dark One returns with his friends who save the day. The Dark Ones are going away for a while, but they promise to return one day.
Artyom, it is time.
And who might this be? The resourceful young man. Tell me, Artyom, savior of the Metro, where are you going?
Artyom, no need for that now.
That was a summary of what happened in Last Light's story, however much of the experience is being drawn into the world. As with 2033, Last Light is still a set of levels that you move through without ever going back to previous locations, however it's amazing how much bigger the world feels this time around. In 2033, each of the stations felt like an actual place that people could live in, but this time you can see the entire ecosystem and economy. The crucial elements of a country are condensed down into Moscow's metro system. In addition to stations that farm pigs and grow mushrooms, there is the station of Venice, which acts as a coastal port, catching and eating mutated creatures that vaguely resemble shrimp if they were a lot bigger and really angry. Best of all is Teatrnaya Station, translated as Theatre Station, which is described as the cultural capital. Admittedly, a lot of the culture happens to be naked women, but there's also a legitimate theatre show which you can watch for 10 full minutes. It's a shame you're restricted to walking through these stations in narrow corridors because it'd be great to explore off the beaten path a bit. I can't think of another game that has created a post-apocalyptic world as believable as this one. It would have been easy to just copy and paste the same assets in all the different stations. Instead, 4A Games put a lot of effort into making each one its own place with its own purpose. One of the problems I had with Metro 2033's world was the complete lack of women. I don't just mean the lack of women as frontline soldiers, although that feels a bit off as well, but the lack of women anywhere. It was a bizarre exclusion that made it feel like you were either missing a huge part of the world where all the women were living, or the metro system had a much bigger problem on its hands in the near future. Well, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that I found the women. The bad news, yeah. The vast majority of the women in Last Light are dancing, stripping, or both. There are a few that aren't, and Anna is one of the major characters, although she predictably becomes a lover by the end of the game. The lap dancing takes place at one of the Metro's seedier stations, so it's technically not out of place in the world. There are also prostitutes, as to be fair there would be. The issue is that with very few exceptions, these are the only roles women play. When you see men playing musical instruments during the theatre performance, you don't think that all men do in this world is play music, because clearly they have plenty of other roles. There's the odd woman selling clothing or helping prepare food, but they are nowhere near as noticeable as the pole dancer you have to walk right past. You always have more ways to interact with the naked women than you do the others. You can give bullets to the dancers, but not the women selling merchandise. You can't talk to the vendors, but you can't move on from this location until you overhear a conversation which in turn leads to you alone in a booth with a topless dancer. There are no situations that require you to stay incognito by, say, pretending to purchase goods from a female vendor. No, it's much easier to just shove some tits in the player's face. To add insult to injury, most of the women in the game look terrible. Character asset models are a bit all over the place anyway, but the women look particularly garish. I guess we aren't supposed to be looking at their face, but the boob physics aren't a lot better. Believe it or not, Last Light has a far worse moment when it comes to its depiction of women. There's a scene about halfway through the game when you reach a bandit camp. You need to head straight down the tunnel, but it will be tough to ignore a woman's screams off to your right. She's trapped inside a train being attacked by two men. As you get closer, it's quite clear she's about to be raped. The visual and oral language isn't exactly subtle. One of the men waits slightly further back and says his friend can have first go because he won the bet. It's not pleasant to watch or listen to, but much like the other ways women are portrayed in the game, we shouldn't pretend it's not a problem women would potentially face in this society. My problem with the strippers wasn't the strippers themselves necessarily, it's the fact they are by far the most prominent women in the game. Likewise with this scene, it's not that I think this should be out of bounds for a video game, it's that it stands out all the more when it's one of the few ways you interact with an NPC during the levels. Plus it's lazy writing. Video games can include sexual assault if the developers want that in there. I 100% support the rights of developers to include these scenes if they want them. I'm also entitled to criticise them. You might remember a bit of uproar after E3 2017 when we were shown a clip of Detroit Become Human, which featured domestic abuse with the player having to help Kara and Alice escape. Many thought this was not appropriate material for a game and were concerned it wouldn't be sensitively handled in a game written and directed by David Cage. Having now played Detroit Become Human, I can confirm that 1, the game is terrible, and 2, the scene is fine. It doesn't do anything to advance the conversation around sexual and domestic assault, but it's not obligated to. In other media such as books, TVs and movies, we don't demand that every scene of abuse say something meaningful about the problem. For some reason, when video games broach these topics, it has to be handled perfectly and change society as we know it. For the most part, players have ridiculously low expectations for storytelling in games. You only need to look at some of the praise for Detroit's story to see an example of storytelling being praised in a game when it would be heavily criticised if told in another medium. Conversely though, when it comes to sensitive topics like domestic or sexual abuse, a game will be torn apart if its depiction is anything other than revolutionary. I don't think this is entirely fair. All forms of art are perfectly able to depict unpleasant scenes, and that includes games. My problem with this scene in Last Light isn't that it shouldn't be in the game at all. Instead, I think it's bad because lazy and cliché writing often fails to have the desired emotional impact, specifically because it's lazy and cliché. The execution is also flat out terrible. Going back to Detroit, saving a girl from an abusive father is an easy way to make a player connect with the child and feel protective of her. For the same reason, it could also fall a little flat because we've seen it so many times before. There are other ways to achieve a close connection between characters, but that requires time, subtlety and skill, all of which seem to be beyond David Cage. Likewise, rape is far too often used as the de facto way to motivate female characters. It's often their backstory and motivation for revenge. Similarly, saving a woman from sexual assault is a disproportionately common way to make a male protagonist look like a hero. What could be more manly than saving a woman from being raped? These are the de facto positions. Need a woman to have a backstory? Add in a rape scene, preferably linked to the antagonist. Need a man to do something good? Have him save a woman from sexual assault. You can go a bit further and say that stuff like this perpetuates negative stereotypes. How often is a man's backstory that he was raped or the victim of domestic abuse? That's a bigger conversation that I'm not equipped to get into. I'll just stick to saying that 4A Games is perfectly entitled to depict a woman in danger of being raped and to give a player the choice of rescuing her. I'm also perfectly entitled to think that it's poor writing, as indicated by my initial reaction when I first came across this scene, which was more apathy than anger. And then you get to the issue with execution. Here's how the scene plays out. Assuming you don't have any major bugs, we'll be getting to that, you can easily sneak up and kill the guard standing watch and then kill the rapist before he's able to get his pants down. So far, so predictable. But then the screen flashes bright blue as you're rewarded with your moral point. What a way to remove any tension from the moment. Ding ding ding, you saved the lady from being raped, please collect your prize. It's terrible. Worst of all, because Artyom is a completely silent protagonist, you can't talk to her afterwards. You just leave her there. She stays on the floor sobbing and you go off to complete your mission. It's uncomfortable and absolutely not in the way it's supposed to be. The reward for this action felt tacky and horrible, but I guess it could have been worse. Shortly after saving the woman, another guard shows up, and the second he sees something wrong, he opens fire on the woman and kills her unless you're really quick. You don't get a second morality point for stopping him from killing her, and as far as I can tell you don't lose any points if he does. So you can stop the woman from being raped, collect your morality point, and then piss off and leave her to be killed. There are better ways to do a scene like this. If you really want to make Artyom save a woman from attack by two men, why not have it be about a dispute over a trade? Perhaps they think she ripped them off or that she could have stolen from them. Why does any scene where you have to save a woman always default to a sexual assault? This scene is a cheap way to make Artyom and the player feel like a hero. At least there's Anna to improve things slightly for women, although once again the writing is pretty cliche. Anna starts off cold towards Artyom, but after he rescues her she quickly comes around to his charms. A female character being rescued is another stereotype, but I'll let it slide. She's Miller's daughter, so it would make sense to take her as a bargaining chip. Besides, Artyom has rescued himself a few times and rescues plenty of others. We shouldn't say it's damseling just because it happens to a female character once. Her relationship with Artyom is unnecessary and tacked on, but you could say the same about relationships in most movies and TV shows. The depiction of women here is the one big negative, but otherwise 4A Games has improved a lot in its storytelling between 2033 and Last Light. Gameplay, however, remains much the same, with the focus once again being on immersing the player into its dark and gruesome world. Nothing much has changed with regards to the mechanics, at least not when comparing the two Redux versions. There's a cool addition later in the game when Artyom starts working with the Dark One. The Dark One helps Artyom identify hostiles in the area and acts as a kind of Witcher vision or whatever you want to call it. Whereas that usually feels like a cheap gimmick, it's something I quite enjoyed here and I'd like to see it fleshed out a bit in Exodus, assuming it can be done in such a way that it doesn't break the game's stealth and difficulty. We already know Artyom has a connection with the Dark One, so while this could feel like a superpower, it does at least feel like one consistent with the world. Best of all, it helps you identify animals that are not yet aggressive towards you, which means you don't have to attack them. This is another part of Last Light I enjoyed. It's not uncommon to see Nosalis or Watchmen run right past you and go on their merry way. Not every enemy exists solely to attack you. This feels like a living world where you're only attacked if you attack first or just scare them. Little touches like this make a huge difference when creating a world. As much as I love the Metro games, there is room for improvement. Enemy AI is still terrible at times. There's the same system whereby if you're in the shadows then you're basically invisible, and if you're in the light you stand out more than a decent Xbox exclusive. There's no great way to trick enemies or get them off their usual path short of making your presence known. Shooting at a nearby light sometimes makes enemies suspicious and sometimes immediately alerts them to your presence. This can happen regardless of whether you're out of the light and using a silencer, so it's not exactly a reliable way to mess with the enemy AI. Enemies usually ignore dead bodies of their comrades or go on high alert or somewhere in between. I don't just want to ask for the game to be better, because I understand that changing AI is complicated. I'd settle for two minor changes. First, the ability to peek around corners would be great. First person stealth doesn't have the obvious viewing advantage that third person games do, so this small change would make a world of difference. The other change would be the ability to throw small items to distract guards. The second one isn't strictly necessary in Last Light or 2033 because both games have stealth paths that you can take through each level without the need to distract guards. If 4A Games were to make changes like the ones I suggested, it would also have to up the challenge in other ways to avoid it being too easy. Stealth in the Metro games is not a tacked on afterthought like it is in, say, Wolfenstein 2 The New Colossus. In that game you could do stealth takedowns and were encouraged to at times, but the levels and enemy placements weren't designed with stealth in mind. You couldn't do much to distract enemies in New Colossus either. Last Light is a much better stealth game because of the stealth paths available to players, however once you realise that every level has a stealth option then it can become a touch easy. Every time you enter a room filled with enemies you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is a predefined stealth route you can take without having to do anything particularly sophisticated. Because you can't distract enemies you know you don't have to. Instead you just look for that part of the environment which doesn't quite fit, the ramp that lets you walk above enemies or the not so subtle way you can move from obstruction to remain undetected. Adding in more stealth abilities without changing anything else would of course make Last Light easier, however the more stealth abilities the game has the more challenge can be worked into the levels themselves. If Artyom can get enemies to move off their fixed path then this can be made a requirement to progress. Or it could make the difference between completely ghosting through a level and having to knock a couple of enemies out on the way. I've always enjoyed this extra level of challenge in stealth games, especially if it can be done as an optional extra, such as the difference between a ghost run and a no-kill run. I'd like to emphasise that I still really enjoyed sneaking around in Last Light, I just would have liked it to require a little more thought in a couple of places. It's always great to get to the end of a level without being spotted, but it's far more satisfying to do that by manipulating enemies instead of taking the fairly obvious path under their feet until you get to the end. Last Light isn't all sneaking. That generally only applies to the underground levels. When you're on the surface you're typically up against animals instead of humans. I should take a moment to point out that the surface looks incredible. Shots of the Kremlin standing amidst the rubble invoke memories of Fallout's wasteland and I desperately wanted to explore. Unfortunately you can't. Despite appearances the surface levels are just as restricted and linear as the underground ones. With very few exceptions you're going to be moving down narrow paths which somehow manage to feel more claustrophobic than the metro tunnels. The environmental designers came up with some fairly convoluted ways to keep the player walled in. They don't always do a great job illustrating where you can go and where you can't. Invisible walls block you from jumping over old cars and other objects you'd easily be able to clear otherwise. I started to just assume I wouldn't be able to go into pipes or jump over cars, but then sometimes I could. On a few occasions you need to approach routes that are clearly blocked off to progress to the next section. I'm only pointing this out as a criticism because the world looks so damn good that I desperately wanted to explore. Last Light is a linear first-person shooter, but I really wanted to go off the beaten path at times. Before discussing the bread and butter FPS combat, it's worth taking a look at Last Light's difficulty modes. In my video on Metro 2033, I spent more time than anyone wanted discussing the game's different difficulty settings and modes. I'll keep it a little shorter this time. As a quick recap, both 2033 and Last Light have a Spartan mode and a survival mode. Each of those has normal and hardcore difficulties plus the Ranger and Ranger hardcore settings. On its initial release, Last Light had easy, normal and hard plus the Ranger modes if you'd pre-ordered or paid separately. The Redux version removed the easy mode for some reason and lumped the rest under the Spartan category. The survival category offers the same settings but with the gunplay more in line with that of Metro 2033. The only differences I can tell between the two are that you move and reload faster in Spartan. After multiple playthroughs of both games, I'm still not comfortable saying exactly what the differences are. These options are excessive. Having 2 game modes and then 2 different ways of playing within each game mode and then different difficulties within those modes is a messy way to start a game. It's not so bad when it's a Redux version like this because you can treat it as a bonus option, but I sincerely hope 4A Games has the confidence to at least settle on things like running and reload speed for Exodus. That's not the sort of decision the player should be making upon booting up a game for the first time. In my Metro 2033 video I found it tough to make a firm recommendation for what difficulty to start on. The Ranger mode is far and away the best way to play the game, but the lack of a HUD in that mode makes it tricky if you don't know what you're doing, especially in Ranger Hardcore. My final recommendation in that video was to stick to the survival category if you're only doing one playthrough. Put a few hours into either normal or hardcore to get the hang of the controls and then start again in either Ranger or Ranger Hardcore. I didn't enjoy playing Spartan mode by comparison. It felt like exactly what it was, a new mode forced onto an old game that had been developed with a different playstyle. Last Light is much more straightforward because it genuinely feels like both survival and Spartan are equally viable and fun. Furthermore, within those categories, both the regular way and the Ranger mode are worth playing. My recommendation is easy this time. Complete 2 playthroughs. Last Light is a damn good game and it can be almost as fun as a shooter as it is as a stealth game. Your first playthrough should be in Spartan on either normal or hardcore as you see fit. Normal is a touch easy, but that's why you're doing 2 playthroughs. On the second playthrough, do Survival Ranger mode or Ranger Hardcore mode as appropriate. Despite the intimidating names, the Ranger modes are perfectly playable, for the most part. I've already discussed how stealth is a completely viable option for sneaking past enemies, but the observant among you might have noticed that the footage accompanying that claim is typically of indoor areas with human enemies. Much of your time in Last Light is dealing with packs of watchmen and a few other enemies such as the shrimp and lobsters. These sections serve a couple of purposes. Obviously it fits the world to have wild mutated creatures outside due to the radiation and a lack of humans for the same reason. Second, the variation helps with the pacing. The regular changes between indoor and outdoor environments stop the players getting bored with a singular environment. Finally, and likely most importantly, these sections are here to drain your resources, both ammo and air filters. If you're like me, you'll be doing your best to avoid combat in Ranger mode due to how weak you are and the sparseness of bullets. 4A Games knows you're going to do this, so it practically forces you to deplete your ammo against enemies that need to be killed and take a fair few bullets in the process. You should treat all interior sections as opportunities to collect ammo and filters for the fights you will inevitably face on the surface within a chapter or 2. I didn't find ammo too much of a problem, but air filters can be in tight supply, especially when in Ranger mode when you only get 3 minutes per filter instead of 5. There are also a few sections that seem designed to use up all your health packs. In sections such as the one where you're fending off shrimp in a boat or soldiers in a rail car, you can't move and it seems impossible to avoid taking damage. I tried ducking down for the entire railcar ride in Ranger mode and used up 4 health kits to get to the end. If you're quick on the trigger you can shoot enemies before they hit you, but with hit scan weapons that can be tough. These sections are frustrating even though they aren't especially difficult. It's not satisfying to collect loads of health kits only to lose them without you having much say in the matter. For a similar reason I didn't particularly enjoy fighting Watchmen and other beasts in Ranger mode. The Ranger modes weaken human enemies as well as Artyom, however that doesn't seem to apply to beasts. Or maybe it does, I found it nigh on impossible to tell. The pistol is strangely effective against Watchmen, with headshots usually being a guaranteed one-hit kill. However, you can fire 10 assault rifle rounds into them without a kill and they will occasionally take multiple shotgun blasts to the face. I'm convinced the hitboxes are all over the place for anything non-human. They move around logically enough until they start attacking, at which point it's just flailing limbs clipping all over the place. When enemies get up close and personal, it seems to be a dice roll as to whether you actually get hit or not. You can move out of the way of claws to avoid swipes but still take damage, or be right up in their face and see them clip through you without impact. Enemies like this are bearable on Spartan normal and hardcore modes because you're playing the game like a shooter anyway. Sure, you still take the odd bit of damage, but you have regenerating health and you'll likely get through the fight anyway. That's not necessarily the case on Ranger mode. You can die quickly and it often feels a little cheap. When you're killed by humans, it's your own mistake. You got caught. With monsters, the difference comes down more to luck. Did that random flail connect with Artyom's hitbox? Did that fire grenade make any difference, or did the Watchman just walk right through it? How many of your bullets connected and what amount of damage was done? It feels far too random for my liking. The good news is that even if you're struggling on one particular section, you'll get through it eventually because the luck can go both ways. I'd love to see the combat against monsters improved or made less about draining existing ammo and getting lucky. For starters, I'd like to be able to take enemies out from afar more often instead of having them spawn in at certain points. As with stealth, more options all round would certainly be welcome. Maybe the monsters could be distracted by throwing meat, or you could cover yourself in animal blood to stop them smelling you. As with stealth, other adjustments would be required to not make the game too easy, but I would have much preferred the chance to avoid losing all my hard-earned ammo. Ranger mode's biggest problem builds off this. It's the boss battles. Metro 2033 didn't really have these and was all the better for it. Good boss battles in stealth games are rare. Forcing you to go in all guns blazing when you've been spending most of your time doing the exact opposite is frustrating and, dare I say it, immersion breaking. One of the bosses is just a larger version of the bog shrimp that you've fought a few times already. You can easily defeat this boss by planting C4 in front of it, which happens to be relatively plentiful in this level. Other bosses such as the bear and the rhino can be a pain. The bear does at least have a weak spot and other Nosalis are trying to take it down, so you're not by yourself. There's a nice touch at the end where you can rescue the bear from the Nosalis so that you don't leave its children behind without a parent. I couldn't figure out any stealth method to take either of these bosses down, so no matter how you're playing the game, you'll find yourself dodging animals charging at you. There's one boss fight against a human opponent, and this is also a little tough on Ranger mode. Artyom finally catches up with Pavel, but he's ambushed and has to shoot his way through about 8 enemies, many of whom have the high ground. There's some cover, although much of it is breakable, and it's hard to ever stay out of the line of sight. When you catch up to Pavel, you have to injure him 3 times before you can finish him off. The challenge in this fight is entirely determined by whether or not you have at least 3 grenades. If you do, you can just lob them up the stairs to get to 3 hits. If not, you've got to get quick shots in while also doing your best to avoid taking return fire. Bear in mind, you've likely just got through a lot of your med packs just to make it to this point. The hit scan weapons also mean that Pavel was likely to hit you the moment his gun appears from around the corner. It feels a touch unfair, but there's a checkpoint right before this and you'll get through it eventually. Not one of these boss fights added anything to the experience, but they could have with a bit of choice. The fights against the monsters could have been optional or had ways to kill them that didn't involve holding your finger on the trigger, such as using the environment to dislodge boulders. Personally, I like the idea of an incentive waiting for you if you fight the monsters instead of running from them. They could be guarding either loot or a person you need to save. You could ignore them and miss out on the loot or the opportunity to save someone, or you could take them on. Forcing all players into the same fights when they could be playing on any one of 8 different modes isn't a good fit. The fight against Pavel didn't need to play out like it did. You're forced to walk into an ambush. I'd have appreciated the chance to stay hidden and maybe get to Pavel's sight unseen. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about the stealth options. If there were more ways to mess with enemies, then stealth could be made a lot harder. Reaching Pavel without his guards spotting you could have been made incredibly difficult. It just would have been nice to have the choice. Not every game has to offer you multiple ways to beat bosses, but games that have a special mode making you extra weak probably shouldn't put you in a position where you're effectively the fish in the barrel. The HUD changes quite a bit depending on what mode and difficulty you're playing. I talked about this a fair bit in the last video, so I won't belabor the point too much. I will just say that I still wish this was customizable and not linked to the difficulty quite so much. I personally don't find a small ammo counter to be immersion breaking, so I'd like to turn it back on. In the PC version of the Metro games, it's possible to check your ammo on Ranger mode by pulling up your compass and then right clicking. However, you can't see this information on the main screen where you check other types of ammo. I have no idea why the game wants you to jump through hoops like this. What's the logic behind moving information from one screen to another just because you've changed the difficulty setting? The morality system for Metro 2033 is back, and this time it's even more confusing. That's quite the accomplishment. If you remember, my main complaint about 2033's morality system was that it rewarded actual moral decisions, plus general exploration and random acts like playing musical instruments. In other words, it felt more like a collectible system where you needed to find all the points instead of just play the game your way. The morality system determined your ending. Either Artyom blew up the Dark Ones or he realised the truth about them and stopped the bombs. This would have fit far better with a system based on rewarding exploration. The more journals you found and conversations you listened to, the better your chances of discovering the truth before it was too late. Last Light course corrects and ends up with the opposite problem. This time around, the good ending should be a reward for being good, specifically for being good when in the presence of the Dark One, and have nothing to do with exploration. However, it's once again a mixture of random moral actions, exploration and eavesdropping. It's also quite hard to get the good ending, which means that by the time Exodus comes around, you could easily have a situation where players expect Artyom to be dead. The good ending sees the Dark One bring his buddies along to save the day just as Artyom is about to blow up D6. He does this because he sees the good in humanity, or at least that's supposedly why he does it. Not all that many moral points are triggered while the Dark One is present, but perhaps he picks up on what you're doing through his psychic link. The good ending is really hard to get with any degree of certainty. I've had a look online and I can't find any agreement on how to get it. It doesn't help that some morality points have been added and removed in the Redux version. I've seen people suggest that you get punished if you kill people instead of knocking them out, and that you should aim to have as few human kills as possible. Others emphatically state that kills don't make a difference so long as you make the correct decisions at major story points, being not shooting at Lesnitsky and later not killing him, and then helping Pavel as he dies. However, I had a playthrough where I was pretty damn thorough in exploring and listening to conversations and made these major decisions correctly but still got the bad ending. I was so convinced I had enough morality points that I assumed my ending was the good ending even though Artyom died. In the epilogue it was revealed he had a child with Anna, so I thought maybe in the bad ending he doesn't have one. Obviously that didn't feel right, so I looked online and sure enough I got the bad ending. This seems to be fairly common. There were horror stories of people playing the game 3 times, following guides to get nearly all the morality points and yet still coming away with the bad ending. I got the good ending on my second complete playthrough, but I couldn't tell you with any degree of certainty what I did to deserve it. Perhaps there's a certain amount of people you can kill before triggering the bad ending. It's certainly got nothing to do with the last chapter because the Dark One makes the decisions of whether or not to help you at the start of the chapter on the train. I don't want to repeat too much of what I said in my 2033 video, but once again I'm left thinking that the current morality system is a good idea that isn't pulled off properly. First of all, it's clearly not a straight up judgment on the player's moral decisions. You're going to pick up plenty of morality points just by exploring the world and looking for resources. Scavenging human corpses for ammo doesn't make you a moral person the last time I checked. You're likely doing this to survive, so it shouldn't affect any ending based strictly on morality. Likewise, listening in on conversations is more about curiosity and rudeness than it is morals. I'd like 4A games to go one way or the other with this. Either restrict the morality system to a judgment on the player's moral actions or have it be about knowledge. What does Artyom know at the end of the game? This is my preference because systems based strictly on moral choices end up being a bit black and white. Do you save the woman from being raped or not? That kind of thing. An ending based on what you know about the world, the Dark Ones and the major antagonists is more interesting. It would punish people who rush through the game and be a decent reward for those who complete a slow and methodical playthrough. I started this video by saying that the first half of the Metro Last Light campaign gave me one of the best gaming experiences I've had in a long time, and then it all went wrong. Twice. This was my second playthrough and I was on Survival Ranger mode. I was determined to get the good ending this time around, and due to the uncertainty around how you get that, I decided to do a no human kill run. This fits well with a Ranger mode playthrough anyway, and as I said, I enjoy the experience of sneaking through levels. Sometimes I would completely ghost through them, and other times I would knock a few enemies out on the way, which is useful to build up resources for subsequent levels. I was completely absorbed in this playthrough. So much so that sometimes I would load a previous checkpoint and start again if I got spotted, even if I was able to make it to safety regardless. Then I reached the bandit level, the one where you have to rescue the woman from being raped. As bugs go, this one is fairly random, but I lost the ability to perform any kind of melee takedown that required an animation. That meant I couldn't do a silent takedown or a silent kill. I could still do a melee attack, but it was a random knife swipe, which is not always a guaranteed kill. I did some research online and found quite a few people who had the same problem, and it always happened in the same place. I tried restarting from the previous chapter, but that didn't help. I restarted the level numerous times, but no luck. The animations wouldn't trigger. I was stuck playing the rest of my playthrough without the ability to do melee takedowns, something that's quite important for no kill runs. You can ghost through most sections, however that means leaving behind a lot of the resources, and in this instance meant I couldn't save the woman, which I needed to do for the morality point. To save her you have to either knock out or kill the 2 men attacking her and the one that comes along later. Without the ability to knock enemies out you absolutely have to kill them. So much for my no kill run. Once I'd resolved to kill these 3 guys I ended up killing plenty more. The will to continue my no kill run had gone. It wasn't the same anymore, but I kept playing and kept having a damn good time. and then the game crashed right at the end of a chapter about 2/3 of the way through. No big deal, I guess, it happens. There's an autosave, so worst case scenario, I've lost a few minutes. Unfortunately, the game kept crashing every time I tried to boot up the level. Once again, I looked around online to see if there were any obvious solutions and found that I was far from the only person with this experience. 4A Games is a relatively small studio, however it's disappointing to see such major bugs still in the game 4 years after release, especially when this is a Redux version. There's a damn good chance this won't happen to you and it could be a PC only issue, but I have to mention it regardless. I'll admit some harsh words were exchanged between me and my monitor, and I went to bed that night feeling a bit pissed off. The next day I started another playthrough. I relaxed the rules a little and let myself use daggers to kill soldiers, and eventually I saw the good ending while still being none the wiser as to exactly what you have to do to achieve that. These bugs should have been fixed, but they didn't take away from what was otherwise a great game. 4A Games is a small team which had to transition to working with a new publisher just 2 months before releasing the game, and then moved from Kiev to Malta shortly after release due in part to political turmoil in the region. When viewed in that context, I am inclined to be more forgiving than usual. On a more fundamental level, 4A Games could do with some cleanup on its engine. Very rarely I found textures flickering in and out of view. More often, knives would seemingly clip through enemies, and characters often skipped multiple frames of animation, darting from one position to another like a laggy multiplayer match. Enemies also had a tendency to get stuck indoors and just generally bug out quite a bit. The AI needs a fair bit of work. There's the same system as in Metro 2033 when it comes to staying out of the light to remain hidden. The clear rules certainly make stealth easy, but it does feel a little stupid when an enemy looks straight at you from just a few feet away and keeps walking. Takedown animations are always completely silent, so you can take down groups of enemies within a few feet of each other, one after the other without raising alarm. While I'm talking technical issues, can we please get some extra save files in Exodus? I'm assuming the reason there's only one save file was somehow tied into immersion. That seems to be the rationale behind most of 4A's decisions with these games. Maybe it was felt that letting players make multiple saves would encourage save scumming and the like. I don't necessarily mind the lack of manual saves, although as with Metro 2033 the autosave points can be a pain. I just wish I could keep multiple playthroughs on the go simultaneously. If you want to go back to an earlier level you will overwrite your entire save file, it's really annoying. On PC there is a bit of a workaround, although it's a pain. Complete the game once and copy all the level save files over to a safe location. Then start a new game on your choice of difficulty and quit out once you've hit an autosave point. This autosave data remembers the difficulty mode and category of survival or Spartan. Copy the level files back into the correct folder and you should be able to do chapter select for the difficulty and mode associated with the autosave file. You might lose out on achievements this way even when doing clean playthroughs later on without this cheat. I never did get the achievement for completing a survival playthrough despite starting from scratch. So 4A Games, please let us use multiple save files. I know this might vary by player, but I've never been bothered by the possibility of save scumming. Just because the option is there doesn't mean I'll use it. I tend to reserve it for games that are buggy or if I just want to experiment with different options. While I'm talking about minor issues I'd like to see changed, it would be great if we could get subtitles for all the conversations. Last Light lets you select Russian language as an option, however it only subtitles main conversations. There's a lot of background small talk which helps with world building, but without subtitles you miss out on all of it. Last Light Redux also comes with a bunch of DLC. If this section of the video feels a bit tacked on and thoughtless, then you'll have some idea of how the DLC feels. One DLC level is almost exactly the same as the final level of the game. You fight waves of soldiers, including a guy in heavy armour being protected by enemies holding shields, and then go up against the train. It's almost identical to that final level, except this time around it's ridiculously hard, especially on the ranger settings. You can barely move from the tiny space allocated to you, and the train keeps raining down missiles that can kill you, even when the impact zone is nowhere near. This is another example of how bad the game can be at communicating what you need to do. Even though the previous train required you to destroy the wheels, this one needs you to get really lucky with some explosives. There's nothing to indicate you're doing damage, so you might think you're doing it wrong. There's other recycled content, such as playing as Anna in the level when she's out in the field with Artyom, and a terrible stealth level with a load of arbitrary rules about what you can and can't shoot to avoid being spotted. All in all, it's really bad. There's a museum where you can view 3D character models, which is quite cool. That's about the only positive thing I have to say for the DLC. I imagine 4A Games wasn't too keen on the idea of doing DLC at all and it was forced on them by THQ. Still, people paid for this, it should have been better. Following E3 and a couple of developer interviews, we know a bit more about what to expect from Metro Exodus. The trailer shows Artyom removing his gas mask on the surface, which is an interesting turn of events. There won't be open worlds as such, but the outdoor areas will be less linear. Hopefully we'll have a little more freedom in the tunnels as well. One minor point I saw in the trailer that I liked was seeing Artyom change weapon attachments while out in the world. This is something you can only fully appreciate if you've played Last Light in 2033. In these games you can only switch out weapons and mods at designated shops in the few stations with vendors. This led to some ridiculous situations where I would head out for a mission in the tunnels complete with silenced weapons and night vision scopes, only to be outdoors a few minutes later trying to fend off beasts with pistols and looking down night vision scopes in broad daylight. It's not so bad in the normal modes where you have 3 weapons on the go, but in ranger modes you only have 2, so it can be a pain. 4A Games improved a lot at storytelling between 2033 and Last Light, so hopefully this will continue. I'd like Hansa to get more screen time in Exodus because that's the faction that's always been a little on the fringes. The good ending suggests we won't be seeing more of the Dark Ones. The young one tells us they're going to go away for a little while and that he will be grown by the time he sees Artyom again. It's possible that a lot of time passes between games, which might explain why Artyom can breathe on the surface without a gas mask. Either way, I hope the Dark Ones are involved somewhere. While I don't want Artyom to become a superhero, I'd be up for seeing him acquire a few powers related to his connection with the Dark Ones. We know the Dark Ones can read minds. Maybe Artyom could acquire this ability as well, which would help him learn the location of weapon stashes and secret routes from enemies before he kills them. I haven't talked much about the slightly spooky parts of Last Light because I don't know what to make of them. I suspect this will forever remain a random, unexplained power that Artyom shares with Khan. It can be pretty freaky at times when Artyom sees the spirits of dead people who appear to have hung themselves, and there are a couple of minor jump scares in there as well.
The river of fate. Not so impressive, perhaps, on the surface.
And 4A Games, you have to do better when it comes to depictions of women. It's actually embarrassing to play at times, and I say this as someone whose mum caught him playing Leisure Suit Larry at the age of about 13. It shouldn't be all that difficult to fix this. Every time a character or NPC is created, ask yourselves whether it needs to be a particular gender. If it doesn't, just flip a coin. As of the time of recording, Exodus is due to be released on February 22nd, 2019, a packed release date that puts it up against games that will likely be mediocre but ridiculously overhyped, such as that Mass Effect game minus the story, another zombie thing, and a long delayed game that's currently having a Battle Royale mode patched into it. I genuinely believe Exodus will be the culmination of a decade-long learning process, much in the same way CD Projekt Red improved over the course of 3 Witcher games. That's not to say Exodus will be quite on the level of The Witcher 3, but I am really looking forward to it. I hope it gets the marketing push it undoubtedly needs to get attention during such a busy period. Okay, that's it for me on Metro Last Light. I have a couple more videos in the works. I plan to release a short video highlighting some of the cool indie and small budget games I've been playing. I haven't felt particularly inspired to do a full video on any of them, but that doesn't mean they aren't worth your time. For example, Yoku's Island Express is bloody brilliant and you should absolutely play it. There's also the next in my series on isometric CRPGs, which will be Baldur's Gate. And I'm playing through the Stalker games. Not sure if I want to do a video on them yet. I've been out of the country for most of June due to family commitments and a funeral, but I'll be back on my regular streaming schedule in July. I believe I'll start with Kingdom Hearts, however, as always, it's subject to change on a whim. Please consider following me on Twitch and Twitter if you aren't already, because it's by far the easiest way to ask questions. Of course, if you could hit the like button, that would be cool, and perhaps subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. I know it's annoying when YouTubers constantly try to boost their metrics, but it is quite important. I'd love to start releasing videos of new games closer to embargo, however to get review copies I need more subscribers, likes, views, Twitter followers and all that stuff. You can also now sponsor the YouTube channel, although of course there is absolutely no obligation to do so. For full disclosure, I get 70% of the amount you pay. Any money I receive from this will of course be added to the revenue breakdown that I update monthly on my website. I'll also be launching a Patreon around the time of this video, so if you'd like to get your name in the credits then keep an eye out for that. I doubt I'll do a separate video for it, there'll just be a link in the description or something. Anyway, thanks for watching through to the end. Until next time, cheers.